running through the agenda today, we're going to go through what a lease is, when it's required, types of leases, the key considerations, NHS approval system, investor-friendly lease terms or market fair lease terms, the benefits of a lease, what a sale and leaseback potentially is for you guys, and then questions and answers. So just a little bit about GP Surveyors. We're a specialist primary care premises surveyors. We're nationwide. We've been practicing over 22 years, and we only deal with primary care. We've helped roughly 3,400 GP practices in our 22 years, and we carry out around 300 notional rents every year. So our evidence basis for market valuations, for hosting webinars, for passing on advice, it's quite broad, and we've got quite a big knowledge basis with the staff we have as well. We do other services bar notional rent, so notional rent, market valuations, sale and leaseback, rent reviews, lease renewals, and anything to do with your pharmacies as well we can help with. So that's just a little bit about what we do and what we specialise in. And yeah, so this is just a few members of our team, some who you might know from speaking to as clients or as people you will see in and around surgeries measuring up. So if we jump right straight through into what we're currently seeing in the current environment of GP properties. Currently, we see there's the ownership model changing. So we've got about 55% of nationwide properties in the primary care premises that are doctor owned. That used to be a much higher split. I'm talking probably only 6 years ago, we would be looking at a much higher split where doctors owned their premises. It was very unusual for a premises to be leased. Now what we're seeing is that's becoming more and more of an option of having a leasehold property where you as doctors just run from the property, you don't own it, and you have a landlord. The reason being for that is, I'm sure we've all heard the buzzwords of last man standing. You know, this is a way to combat that feeling and that pressure. So yeah, as we've gone through the years and we're seeing lease properties start to change and start to see them potentially, and I would think in the next few years, take over from the amount that are doctor owned. It's going to become more and more of the current view of ownership models that we see, and it's very much backed by ICB and NHS. They understand that this is the way forward. You know, doctors are very much coming through the system and coming through, you know, working and becoming partners. Very much the current environment is, and the current understanding is, they don't want to own property. It's a massive mortgage, you know, all those sorts of things that we hear. They come out of university with huge fees, you know, they leave huge fees. Personally, and my personal opinion on it is, owning a GP property is still very profitable. It's still a very good business decision, but the environment is changing. So we'll move on to what is a lease. The very easy way to tell you about leases is the 4 Ps. So we've got property, price, parties, and period. If you don't have one of these things, your lease is invalid, or it's not classed as a lease. It might be classed as a license, might be classed as a contract. But if you don't have all these 4 things located within the document, it's not a lease. So property, the property is named. So let's take one that we've got on the market currently, Orms Medical Centre, Norfolk. The postcode will be on there, and that is the property. So that's named on the document. Parties, landlord, tenant. They have to be named personally or by company. Period. That is the length of time the lease will run for. Standard is about 15 years. And price, that's the rent. That's the rent you're going to be paying on certain dates to the landlord. Those are the 4 basics that you need in any lease. If you don't have them, it's not classed as a lease. The property usually will sit with a plan. So you will name the property within the lease, and there will also be a plan within the lease. It's the demise of the property, whether you're taking on just the internal space whether you're taking on the whole property and the land, which will include car parks and all that sort of stuff. We'll move through this and you'll start to understand the differences. You might have access to use the car park, but you might not necessarily look after it. And those are the types of things that when you get into the nitty-gritty of leases is what bulk it out. But if we're just going to stay really general, really easy, these are the 4 things you need. Details of who the parties are. So for example, a surer could be a landlord, and then the tenants will be Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones. It's not the practice that's the tenant. It's always named parties. You have to have a minimum of 2 signing it. So you always have to have 2 people on the lease that will sign the document. One of those has to be the contract holder, GMS, PMS, APMS contract holder. They have to be on there. The other can be anybody. It could be the practice manager, it could be the lead nurse, it could be a business manager, a financial manager, it could be another partner. So you have to have a minimum of 2. That will secure the last man standing problem, because you always have to have a minimum of 2 on there, and a maximum of 4. If you have a bigger partnership, then what will happen is your partnership agreement will sit alongside the document, and it will say that all partners are under the rights and obligations of the lease, and when one partner retires and gets removed from the lease, the next partner that has come within the surgery will sign on to it. And those documents sit side by side at one another. Price is the rent. So it's the rent that you'll receive from the NHS, very much like your notional rent. Comes in one day, goes out the next to the landlord. And then the period of time. So standard is 15 years. That's the market norm. That's what the ICBs are appreciating to see. It also runs really well with what your hypothetical lease terms are for notional rent. So what we're trying to do is create this scenario where actually the day-to-day runnings that you're currently seeing in the property don't really change when you go into a lease. So we'll move across onto a poll, just so I understand the audience we're speaking to currently, and I'm sure Tom will launch that for you now.
Okay, here's our first poll. Should be coming up on your screens now. Just a straightforward question: does your practice currently have a lease in place? A couple more people to answer that. So it's a pretty even split. Rebecca, is 50% yes, 40% no, and 10% aren't sure.
Okay, no worries. So is there any questions, Tom, and then I can just have a little look, have a little gander.
No questions as yet, no.
No. Okay, so we'll move on to a lease and when it's required. So for those who've already got a lease, we'll move forward to what that kind of means and what you should be looking at, and those type of document in a bit. But when you should have a lease is really easy. It's when you have uncommon parties within the property. So if not all the owners still work within the premises, you need a lease. It only takes one of those GPs to retire when actually legally you need a lease to be brought in. Now, fully understand it is not always beneficial, and it's not always appropriate for the practice to buy out retiring partners straight away. And usually your partnership agreement will give you a certain amount of time to be able to do that. So it could be 12 months, could be 18. And you have that time period to work out whether A, you can afford to buy them out, or B, whether you want to. That within that time frame, you need to work that out. And then if you're not going to buy that partner out, a lease has to be put in place, because as an uncommon party, who no longer has access within the premises to make change. So he needs to make sure his rights and obligations of the property to look after it are secure, and he's secured in receiving rent. And you also, as tenants who no longer have all your landlords within premises, need to make sure that you, A, if something goes wrong with the property, you know who's looking after it, and B, if it's something that an owner landlord should be looking after, you can ask them to sort it out with the repair rather than a payment out of your business accounts. Another way to look at it is if you have an uncommon party, you need a lease, but also you could have something called a license, and that license could be something up to 3 years. If you have anything over 3 years, so you're looking to put a document in place for 15 years, because you know that's the market norm, you know that it'll go through NHS approvals, then you need a lease. Anything over the 3-year mark, you need a lease put in place. Anything over the 7-year mark, those leases have to be registered to land registry, and they attract stamp duty land tax. The reason I'm mentioning these things is because usually when a lease becomes involved, normally there's going to be a sale at some point. It doesn't have to be straight away, but a sale of the property may be imminent. It might be 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, and so on and so forth. If it is, all these things will come into play, which will mean if you're looking to put in a market fair lease where you know somebody's going to buy it and everybody will step away and just work as partners within the business, then the lease should be 15 years long. It will attract stamp duty land tax. Stamp duty land tax is payable by the tenant, which is the practice, and so on and so forth. So these are costs that you need to be aware of before you go down this road. If you're buying your partners out because you have incoming GPs coming in and they're buying in, and you know it works like the normal model would, then I would say don't change the model until you have to change the model, but be very aware that succession planning will change over time. We've seen that recruiting GPs is a real struggle. Recruiting partners is even more of a struggle. And then in recruiting partners who want to buy into the property is even more, it's like another layer of problematic for the practice. You don't get very many people who are willing to buy into property anymore. Hence why leases have been approved, created, this dynamic has been sorted out. So we'll go on to types of leases. This is where you kind of start to get into a bit more of a nitty-gritty. So you understand that you need a lease, you've got an uncommon party, Dr. Smith has retired, he's happy that you can't buy him out straight away, but he would like to make sure that his investment, the property, and his rent is secured to him by putting a lease in place. I always recommend a tenant's internal repairing lease. The reason I always recommend this is because it runs alongside how your notional rent has been calculated since you became surgery. So what that means is when the district valuer comes out and he looks at your surgery, he's looking at your surgery through a hypothetical lease term to be able to value it for rent. Those hypothetical lease terms are 15 years in term, 3 yearly rent reviews, a tenant's internal repairing lease, which is what we're going to go on to, and that it's secure with multiple partners of the property. And then, you know, so rent then divulges into the state of the property, what kind of taps you have, what kind of flooring you have, whether you have air conditioning, whether you have drop-down sinks, all that sort of stuff, drop-down counters. That will affect your notional rent. But the core of it, the core hypothetical lease terms, runs really nicely with tenant's internal repair and lease. And I've always said, if you're going down the lease route, this is the one where you actually find less complication, because if everything was cut and dry and black and white, this is how you should have been running your premises. The owners should be taking care of the structure, the outside, and the insuring of the property. And then the business accounts should be taking care of the repairs within inside the property. So we'll get down to it. Tenants internal repairing is where the landlord is responsible for the cost of the external repairs. External repairs are outside brickwork, the car park, gardens, signage, those types of things. The landlord also will pay the building's insurance and look after the structure of the property. So that's things like the roof, walls, like again, floors, anything that makes the structure of a property, they are looking after. Lift, shafts, all that sort of stuff. And the tenant is responsible for internal repairs and maintenance. So that is anything from the plaster in. So if, for example, you have some of the floorings coming up, just through general wear and tear, you're expected to fix that through practice accounts. The big one, the one that I'm always asked, windows and doors and boiler. Those three things will be asked until the end of time, I think. So windows and doors, that's getting into very, very much nitty-gritty, and that's something that solicitors will argue could fall either way. The DV, district valuer, sorry, will argue it could fall either way. The way we view it is you can do it two ways. You can say the windows are part of the structure, they fall into the landlord repair. You could say that the window frame falls into the structure, but the window glass will be internal. For the doors, exactly the same. You could argue that the door is internal, but the door frame is external part of the structure. You could do it a number of ways. And the thing with creating a lease is it's all part of negotiation, because not everybody is going to have the perfect scenario. What you have got is you've got to learn to compromise, unfortunately. This isn't where you've got all owners within the building and all the owners will say, yes, we're looking after it. Somebody's retired, they no longer work within the property, or you've got a third party who has nothing to do with the inside of the property. You know, these things are, you know, it's give and take. I always suggest you trying to put them into the external repair in obligations, but be very aware that usually after a negotiation, you'll be looking after either the pane of glass or the frame, one or the other. In regards to the boiler, technically the boiler is internal, but it is also part of the structure. It's another massive negotiation. So usually what happens is the tenant is responsible for the maintenance and service of the boiler. If the boiler goes pop, it is up to the landlord to replace it. But if you've already got a lease in place, and I can't stress this enough, it will say that within the lease what your rights and obligations are. This is as if we're creating a new lease. If you've got a lease in place, you need to go through your lease with a fine-tooth comb and decide who looks after what. And it should have been decided when it was created. If it's not mentioned, then it is up to a personal viewpoint on it, and it's probably going to create some negotiation. But a good lease will mention it. So then we move on to...
We've just got one question. Yeah. That's a bit of a natural break before you go on to the other type of lease. We've just got a question here. If 2 out of 3 of the partners own the property and the third partner has not bought in, how soon should a lease be put in place? Presumably this partner must be paying a lease fee into the practice, and how would this equate to the notional rent?
So right, there's two things there. If you've got owning property owners and business property partners in the same building, they're not a difference of partnership. You're allowed to have business partners and owner partners still in the same thing and not have a lease in place. The only difference is when you've got owning property partners who are no longer within the property. So my understanding, tell me if I'm right, Tom, is that they've written that both owning partners are still at work in the property.
So yeah, I think there's some, like as you've just pointed out, I think there's some confusion over what is the difference in the parties. It sounds like two of the partners own the property and one doesn't. So I guess really the question is, do they want to buy in?
Yeah, so if they've not bought in, then they're just a business partner. They don't have to pay any sort of lease. They don't have to pay towards rent or anything like that. The rent you get is from the notional rent, and the notional rent should go to the owners who are still in property working. The only time you need a lease is if one of the property owners has left the property and no longer works for under the practice. That's the only time. Or you have a third party who owns the business, owns the property. If all your property owners are in the property working, then you don't need a lease. You could have business partners, but they just work with the business. They don't have anything to do with the property. Hope that helps.
Okay, has that answered the question, Dr. Saeed?
Feel like probably not. The hand's still up. Is there any more questions that
I've just allowed your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I couldn't see. I couldn't speak. So, no. What I was going to say was, so our particular situation, we've got two partners. Well, we've got three partners. Two partners own the building.
Yeah.
One partner has not bought in and may not buy in.
Yeah.
So currently, obviously, we're getting notional rent.
Yeah.
Presumably that partner also is as well for being a partner.
No. So notional rent should go to your owning partners. That would be it. So your notional rent should go to your owning partners. Your third partner who's not bought in shouldn't receive any of the notional rent. Just like in an ideal world, and how you should run your practice is, notional rent should be passed to the owners, and the practice accounts for the business should rely on practice funds and how you get that, whether that be through third parties coming and providing services, or NHS grants and all that sort of stuff. But the notional rent goes to the owners to be able to look after the property.
Yeah, so what I'm saying, yes. So what I'm saying is, so the third partner for working in that practice is then not usually an arrangement where they actually pay the practice for actually working from that practice because they don't own the building.
No, not if they're, I mean, it depends. If you're offering it out as a room for them to work from, but it's not your I'm guessing you're paying them a salary. You've hired them. So no, they don't lease workspace from you now.
Right. So they're kind of working there for free though, aren't they? From the practice, because the partners that are working there are actually able to use any of the rooms at any of the time. And you've got the third partner that is making use of that building, but actually doesn't own the building.
That would be like your nurses and your receptionists. They're not paying a rent to work from behind the reception desk or for the rooms. You're paying them to offer a service so you can practice for your patients. The business side of things is different. They're not renting a space unless they're a private GP doing, I don't know, for example, some GPs do cosmetic work and things like that, but that's a separate agreement. They shouldn't be leasing rooms from you when they're a paid doctor for you because you've hired them into the partnership.
Well, no, they're an employer though. They're a partner. They're not a salaried, so they're not an employee.
But they still wouldn't pay. They wouldn't rent a room from you. They're a partner within the business, and you're receiving notional rent for the building, and so that notional rent should go to you. that no other payment should be made if they're a partner within the business.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on. So there's another type of lease which is more common. There are other types of leases, and these are the two most common to the market and to ICB approvals and things like that. So we're just going to talk about these, but there are others that we could talk about going down the line. Full repair and insuring lease is where you as the practice, as the tenants, would look after the whole property and retain a small portion of rent. Now that rent differs depending on your property, your location, and the age of the property. So it's usually between 4 and 8%. We normally say 5% is a good figure. If you have a brand spanking new building, it leans more towards the 4%. If you have an older building that's converted, for example, from a house, you lean more towards 7.5% to 8% of what you will retain of the rent. But this is to be able to look after the whole building and to insure it. When you go through it, it's not a lot of money. And you were expected to keep the building in the same state of repair as when you signed the lease, which will have been 15 years prior. So, for example, if you got to the end of your lease after 15 years and you go and walk around and it's not in the same spec, it doesn't have to be better spec, but it's not in the same spec, you're expected to put the building back, and you will have only been retaining for that period 5% every year. Let's use 5% for a round number. And that will have expected to go through a sink fund. So, for example, the roof falls off or crashes down or whatever. The insurance that you've been paying and the money in the sink fund should cover that. But likelihood is it won't, because it's quite a big cost and quite a big repair to make. So yeah, so the idea of it being, and how the NHS look at it and what they approve of it, is it should be 2.5% for the insuring obligation of the building and 2.5% for the repairs every year. So some years you won't need to make a repair, so that money will go into a sink fund, and then some years you will, and that's how it works. These types of leases I only really recommend on a brand spanking new building, and that's from anything kind of 2021 now onwards. And I think we can all agree that there's not many brand spanking new buildings nationwide, either being built by the NHS or by third parties. So, you know, there's not many of these leases that I would advise to take. We went through a stage where, you know, Assura really sent out letters saying they would look to buy properties with a full repair and insuring lease in place, and they gave you a figure of what they would buy that for. Fair enough. You sometimes will attract more money for a full repair and insuring lease from people like Assura, but the likelihood is that it is more obligation for you guys that are signing the lease, and sometimes a bit more of a risk, if I'm completely honest. So yeah, so what will happen is your rent will come in from the NHS, same as always. You then will retain 5% of that rent and then pass the remainder of the rent on to the landlord. And that will be it. The landlord won't be on the other end of the phone to do any repair work or anything like that. You'll be responsible for the property. Now, with all leases, from tenants internal repairing leases to full repair and insuring leases, if you're wanting to make changes within the property, for example, you're wanting to create a new consultation room, you're wanting to change what a store cupboard is from, you know, a store cupboard, you're going to knock through a wall, you have to get landlord's permission. So when you put a lease in place, you have to ask for landlord's permission for any structural changes you're going to make to that property. So bear that in mind. Some of the costs will be bared onto you guys, some of the costs will be bared onto the landlord. It very much depends on how the deal is done, but you will have to ask for permission to make the changes to that property. So
we've just got one question in regarding that last section of lease types. If you've got a TIR lease, can there be a service charge applied by the landlord?
Yes, a service charge can apply to any kind of lease. Service charge is a huge one, and it's probably a good thing that's been brought up. So I'm sure you've all been made aware. If not, it's definitely something to go and look into if you've got leases already. NHS Property Services recently won in court for service charge, and what happened was they had a number of leases where they had a service charge that was astronomical. It was huge in quite a lot of surgeries, and the surgeries just couldn't pay it. They've recently taken those surgeries to court, won in Court of Appeal, and now those surgeries are having to pay those service charges. Now, some of these service charges, because they haven't been paid over a number of years, are up into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they're on payment plans to be able to pay them. I am an advocate. No service charge should ever be put into a lease, because it's not reimbursed by the NHS. It's something that has to come out of practice funds, and service charge can escalate quite massively. We've seen it before. So where it started off as £5,000, it ended up in £25,000 and more and more and more, because there's no cap on it. Or it's quite and I hate to use this, but it is quite scary. So when we create leases, or primary care solicitors create leases, service charge is something we look to avoid at all costs, because it's something that you're already providing for yourselves. So it'll be things like the bins, cleaners, clinical waste, all that sort of stuff that you're already finding contracts for and providing for yourself. That can be included in service charge. So we try to mitigate putting it into a lease. Now, I'm not saying it always happens, and if you already have a service charge in your lease, you are legally obliged to pay that, but make sure you're getting the services that it's promising you in return. But going forth, the advice I give is that it's not really needed. You know, you're already providing those services for yourself through the contracts that you might have found. So why would you then start paying somebody to provide that for you, when it'll be more money because you're paying for somebody else to do it for you. So you're paying for the ease and the comfort of it, and it might not be capped. Now, recently NHSPS have come out and said, you know, it's been agreed by court that it's fair to pay those, but these leases that were put into place years ago. It was when leases were, as you've seen, not really the standard norm. So as we've developed practice and primary care solicitors have developed, and we all started to understand the reimbursement on leases and things like that, everybody in the sector, their knowledge has grown, and they understand that actually it's not something we would recommend. It's not something we would agree to. So if you've got one currently, I would look into what services they should be providing for that. If you're looking to put a lease in currently, I would say have it swiped from the lease. No need for it. It shouldn't really be in there, and you don't get rent reimbursement for it from NHS. So when you go through your approvals process, which we'll talk about in a bit, is that the NHS will give you your normal rent, but they won't give you any more for service charge. It's not a reimbursable fee. So I hope that helps. But yes, you can have a service charge on any type of lease. And it applies, so there's different ways to look at service charge. If you have a third party currently within your premises, then service charge, yes, you would provide service charge for them using your electricity, your water, your, gas, the reception staff. There would be a service charge to be in place if they're not paying you a rent. So there are ways where service charge works, but within leases to a landlord, I don't see it working. So it would be a case of case by case, or what's going on within the surgery currently. But yeah, it's not something we advise to take. So questions before signing the tenant. So these are things just to think to yourself. So things that I always, the one thing I massively recommend for anybody who's looking to do a lease or anybody who's looking to start their succession plan is sit down with your partnership and have an open and frank, honest conversation. And that looks like asking the hard questions of, when do you think you're going to retire? Do you want buying out straight away? Would you be happy to be a landlord? And then you'll start to realise, actually, you know, well, what we need to do, because creating a lease and putting a lease in place takes time. And if somebody is wanting to be bought out, you know, that takes time too. So you need to start asking the tough questions and having an understanding of when you should start the lease process, when you should start the buyout process. And you can have those dates in mind. They don't have to stick, and you can always change your mind, but they're the starts of things for a succession planning meeting. And they're the things that feed lovely into this, because once you understand that actually maybe a lease is possible, then you need to start asking about your building. Well, is it fit for purpose currently? Is it something that's part of the NHS state strategy? Is the building, you know, currently when you walk around it, does it work for you as a practice? You know, have you, since COVID, numerous practices have done the one-way mechanism. You know, can you get around the surgery in one way, or do you find that you have to go to and fro in corridors? You know, is there a back entrance that you could use and make it an actual entrance and exit? And all those types of things, they're things to think about now, because when you start putting a lease in place, the building will remain as it is unless it's agreed by the landlord to change it. So those are the things to think about. You also need to think about, well, who's going to be my landlord and who will sign the lease? Those are two huge ones. So if your retiring partners are going to be your landlord and you have a good working relationship with them, brilliant. If your landlord is going to be a third party who is an unknown, you want to make sure your lease is pretty detailed with how long it's going to take for repairs to be, you know, when to contact, how to contact, all that sort of stuff. You know, you hear about Assura, PHP, but there's a lot of other third-party investors that are single-handed, that are working for banks, that are trust funds, and all that sort of stuff. So if you're going down the lease route, try and learn a bit more about a potential landlord, and then also who's going to sign the lease. So as tenants, who's personally going to sign the lease? As I mentioned before, it has to be a GMS contract holder and one other person. And that's the case for it all. So if, for example, you already have a small partnership where you've got 2 remaining GPs and one of them is looking to retire, then we need to start looking at either diversifying your partnership so that somebody else could come into the partnership other than GPs, or you would need to recruit before that GP left because you wouldn't be able to sign a lease. Whole time.
Okay. Have we covered off an explanation of last man standing in kind of more detail?
No, but I can do it. That's not a problem.
Yeah, I think normally we probably covered kind of just a description of what it is. I think we've kind of just skipped a bit, I guess, because that was the next poll. But it's getting building me. I'm not sure we've actually covered that talking point yet.
No, it's fine. So last man standing is where you only have 2 GPs within the property and one of those is looking to retire. So you would be left with 1 GP. You would be left with the person who holds the GMS contract, and that would be it. So that's the last man standing problem. And what it means is that if you have only 1 person in partnership, you can't sign a lease, which means that you can't sell the building. And if you have 1 GP in partnership, the risk of, for example, people looking to buy it becomes higher. and you have nobody to come in and sign the contract over to. And as we've discussed, partners who are coming through the system don't really want to buy in. So you are at risk of holding this building for a lengthy period of time and never getting your equity out of it. You're also at risk of, if, for example, you don't manage to recruit anybody, the risk that you run is that you have to hand back the contract back when you look to retire. You've got to retirement agent. You can't find anybody to take over the contract. You've tried. And you've only potentially got, you might be a small practice, you might have got 3,000 patients. You would fit into the dynamic where the NHS would say they will take your contract back and disperse those patients into other practices. And then you'd be left with an empty building, and that empty building would not be as valuable as a practice that's being run from that building with a lease in place, or a practice that's being run. So, you know, you would lose quite a lot of money out of the property. The only times that that's not the case is in parts of London where it could be sold as more of a residential house or something like that. So it's really important that if you've got money within the property, equity within the property, you find a way to stop last man standing, because what will happen is you will get to retirement age, you won't be able to find a partner to take over the contract. You'd have to hand the contract back. The property would then be empty, and then you would walk away with not all your money out of that property from the sale.
Okay, so that leads nicely now into whether anyone is at risk of last man standing. And most people responded now, so again it's 50-50 between responses.
Okay, so I would say those who are at risk, you need to start looking at your succession planning. So if you've put yes, put yes, and you are at risk of last man standing because you're already the last man standing, then yes, definitely have a conversation with us or the NHS, you know, about what that succession looks like for the property. You definitely want to find out whether you're part of the NHS estates strategy moving forward. But yeah, definitely look at that.
Okay, we've just got one question about last man standing before we push on to the next part.
Yeah.
To overcome the last man standing, can you not have a silent partner from the landlord?
So they would be your landlord on there and also sign as a tenant, is what I'm understanding. So you could, if the landlord was happy to do that. Not many landlords are, and the problem is that they wouldn't be a silent partner because they would be signed on as a tenant, so they would still have equal rights to say on that lease. It works different in business than it does on property. So you can still have a lease, not a problem, but equally you'd still have the issue of your contract. So when you look to retire, if you couldn't hire anybody else in, if that landlord couldn't hold the GMS contract, you would still have to hand that contract back. You're back to the start. So the idea would be you have a partnership with two people in who could hold that contract. Equally, I'm just trying to work out that idea. You can't hold a contract unless you've been approved to hold a contract. Ideally, if you're already stuck at that point where you are the last man standing, there is another option. There is something called a sale and transfer of contract, but it doesn't happen an awful lot. You are reliant on somebody wanting to take over your contract. So yes, there is another option rather than just handing back your contract, but it doesn't work for everybody, and it's not a guaranteed mechanism for getting your equity out. So yeah, I would say if you're already in that pressure point of that pressure cooker of, you know, I'm the only person here, I don't know what to do, definitely give us a call and we can run through your options and we can talk to you about sale and transfer of contract, because it's not really suitable for this webinar, but I'm more than happy to discuss it with you. That's fine. Okay, so benefits for a tenant. So the benefits for a tenant would be that it secures your property for you to work in it. That's a massive one. So securing the property to be able to go in there and work for patients, be a doctor, fine, not a problem. It gives you the clarity of who looks after what, who repairs what, who maintains what. Clarity, it's really black and white. It secures the property for NHS improvement grants. So if you don't have all your owners within premises and you effectively do have a landlord but not a lease in place with that landlord, the NHS do not have to approve you for improvement grants. They don't have to approve anybody for an improvement grant, but you are not likely to receive one because you do not have security of tenure in your property, which means the NHS could give you an improvement grant, you could do all the improvement works, and then you could be served a notice to leave the property because you don't have any formalisation of the right to be within it. So they won't give you an improvement grant. Equally, for the NHS to give you an improvement grant, you need to have longer than 10 years remaining on your lease. So if you already have a lease in place and you're wanting to make improvements to the property, check with the landlord that it's suitable and that they're happy to go ahead with it. And then when you're looking at your lease, you need over 10 years to qualify for an improvement grant. And that's so that the NHS can make sure that the works that have been done, they can still regain their money from the grant. Secures your NHS contract, secures your rental reimbursement. Again, it's unlikely to happen, but it can happen. We've seen it happen. If you do not have a lease in place and the NHS find out that none of the owners are within premises, they can stop your rental reimbursement. So it's worth having a lease just to secure your rent reimbursement and to secure the property. So yeah, so that's some of the benefits for a tenant. Benefits for a landlord. With any lease, it's transferable from tenant to tenant, landlord to landlord. So yeah, so it's transferable. You don't always have to hold the property. And likewise with tenants, you don't have to sign on for 15 years. You can have different people sign the lease and you can come off. Clarity of rights and obligations, who's looking after what. I can't stress this enough. When you have a lease in place, you avoid a dispute, which means if you've got no lease in place and you're dealing with a partner that's retired and you have a window is smashed or your door's blocked or something like that, and you don't know who's going to make the repair, it can go back and forth that nobody's going to do it. So then you're stuck in a building where there's repairs to be made. You can't do them because you don't think it's your obligation to do it. The landlord doesn't think it's theirs. So you take it to solicitors. Solicitors' fees are costly. They might take it to court. That's another costly in effect. And what the court will say to you is, you need a lease put in place. And that would avoid all this. Those kinds of disputes goes into the tens of thousands of pounds. You know, we've seen them go up to sort of 50 grand before because they just do. And then you will walk away with somebody saying, that's your repair, you make it. So you not only have you got the repairs to be made at the property, you've also got the solicitor's fees and everything else to pay. So it's just protecting your rights, your obligations, and all that sort of stuff. And it protects the investment value for a landlord. When you have a lease in place, it is formalising the occupation of that property. It's formalising the rent that they will receive for their specific time, which protects the investment value. So if you're looking to sell the property, this is what's going to protect that value of what you can make on the property. Okay, NHS approval. So you've created your lease, you've gone for a tenant's internal repair, your solicitors have drawn it up, everybody's in agreement. It goes to the NHS for them to approve it. The ICB will have it, they will send out a district valuer, it will go through their value for money reports, and then they will come back and say, yes, I'm happy for you to sign it, or no, we want wording changes or something like that. The reason you get NHS approval is because that is where the rent is coming from. If you don't have NHS approval and you've signed a lease without it, A, you are obliged to pay whatever that rent is under that lease. And B, the NHS are not obliged to pay that rent back to you. So you could have a discrepancy in rent, which we've seen, and you're just trying to omit that discrepancy as much as possible. But also, the NHS will value the property on their terms, how they see it, and you will have another surveyor who's working potentially for the landlord who will value it on the lease terms because that's what's signed. So you need the NHS to approve it to avoid property disputes again. If the NHS come back and say, we're not happy with that, there's a reason for it. So we would look at it as surveyors and say, right, they're not happy because of the wording. What will that wording change mean for everybody? Is it reasonable, or is it the NHS thinking that it needs to be something else? The reason why we would always look at it and not just agree with the NHS is because usually the reason you're putting a lease in place is to sell the property for some purpose, whether it be the landlord's looking to sell it or the tenants looking to do a sale and leaseback. So we want to make sure that it's marketable as well. So yeah, so anything to do with leases, always get the NHS approval for it. It takes a lot of time. You can draw up a lease and everybody be happy with it within a couple of months. It can sit with the NHS for several months before they do any work on it. So yeah, so bear that in mind. So investor-friendly lease terms. Tenants internal repair, full repair insurance, both are investor-friendly if you're looking to sell. They're both market norms. Don't worry about whichever one you want to pick. Obviously, I advise the tenants internal repairing lease, but that might not be appropriate for you. Lease length. Lease length is usually 15 years, and that is what normally is approved by the NHS as well. Rent review provisions. 3 yearly, again, approved by the NHS. 3 yearly rent reviews, they normally fall in line from whenever the start date of the lease is. They normally are that they are open to market rent, which means that a surveyor will be involved. It's not open to, for example, retail price index, because that isn't NHS approved as a system of being able to review your rent. So yeah, so it normally goes all the way same as your current notional rent review goes. The NHS will give you a value, the landlord will give you a value, and then there's a negotiation process. Armageddon clause. Armageddon clause is a very specific clause, which is if the NHS ceases to exist, then the lease ceases to exist. It is only appropriate if the NHS have agreed to the lease. If you haven't got NHS approval, it's unlikely that this clause will have been put into your lease. And no break clauses. That is normal. We do have leases that have break clauses in. What we find is that there is specific terms why they have been put in. It isn't market norm for landlords or for tenants, and it's not market norm for the NHS either, unless there's something going on in the background. For example, you're moving into a new build in 7 years. We're going to put in, and that's been confirmed in writing, we're going to put a break clause in at year 7. If you put break clauses in your lease, your value for sale will reduce. So, for example, you're giving with one hand, you're giving the right to break the lease, but taking the value away from the property. So it's all a balancing scale for everybody. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly mention sale and leaseback. So sale of your building to an investor once you've been signing a lease, and it's allowing you to get your equity out of the property. Sale and leaseback's really appropriate for succession planning. It's really appropriate if you've got partners that are leaving and you can't afford to buy them out. So it is something that we are seeing more and more of, and we have had a lot of clients happy with using this option of service. But yeah, it's becoming more and more as an option for those who can't afford to buy their partners out of retirement. This is a third option of how to do that. Okay, very aware of time, but are there any questions that I should be answering, Tom?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that have come through. One from Jim Thornton. What do we do if the landlord refuses to accept the NHS terms for a new lease? We have an existing lease that has come to an end, so they're basically renewing. And what happens in that scenario if they refuse the terms, the landlord?
So it very much depends on what your old lease stated. If your old lease stated that it was inside the Landlord and Tenants Act of 1954, you have the right to renew that lease on the exact same basis. The only thing that would change is the date and the rent. If your lease doesn't state that and it falls outside of that act, brand new terms need to be negotiated. So it very much depends on what you're saying is NHS. If you've had a standard lease drawn up from, for example, BMA Law, where they've sent you their template, yes, it's a negotiation process. If you're inside that act, though, you have a right to renew exactly the same lease that you've had before. And the tenant and the land, and in the same way, if you fall within that act, the landlord is in his rights to ask the same lease be put in place. So yeah, it's a negotiation to be had. If you're wanting changes of term and changes of types of lease and all that sort of stuff, it's definitely much something to talk to the landlord about. The NHS will give you if you've just had a template sent through from the NHS, that is their perfect reality scenario. It doesn't mean that changing some of those things won't get you NHS approval. That is what we love to see, what makes life easy for them. But in reality, some of those things are going to be changed later down the line from negotiations. I hope that helps.
Okay. There was another one. I'm just scanning back up to find it. This is kind of covered, or we've kind of talked about last man standing, but I guess it's a slightly different scenario, so they want clarification. What would happen if you have two partners and one partner who owns the practice and one who doesn't? The owning party wants to retire and presumably sell the practice, but the other partner does not want to buy or hold a lease with a landlord.
So again, you can't have it all your own. I hate to say this, you can't have it all your own way. So the options are: you sign a lease, you buy the person out, or you look at the sale and transfer of contract option, which would mean you would no longer be a partner within the business. You'd probably become salaried. That's the likelihood of that event. But yeah, the owning partner has every right to be asked to buy out and has every right to sell the property. And if you're going to remain in position, he has a right to ask for a lease. Equally, he has the right to do, if he's the GMS contract holder, the right to look at a sale and transfer of contract. So it's not that he holds all the cards, it's just that you need to make a decision as to which one you want to go ahead with. You either, look to be a salaried GP within the current premises and either go for a sale and transfer of contract. You either hold more control and decide to be a tenant and run the business, or you decide to buy them out and become an owner. The thing that I would state though is, realistically, you're going to be a last man standing unless you can recruit somebody. So yeah, if you're going to sign a lease, you need somebody else to sign it with you. So that's something to take into consideration.
Okay. There's no other questions have come through. There's just one last. I'll just put our details up on screen so you've got the contact details. Just a quick poll, just basically asking kind of how we've done today, and kind of things that need to improve on. If you've got anything else you'd like us to cover in a future webinar, if you just pop any topics in the chat, we'll certainly obviously look to do webinars based on what audiences want, so we can put those together certainly. So if you've got any ideas, just pop it in the chat, or obviously if you need to have a chat with us about any specific scenarios we've covered today or anything else to do with your property, our details are on screen, so we can set up a call or just respond by email or have a Teams call. And yeah, I'll send out copies of the slides to everyone, and I'll also send out a recording to everyone obviously that's attended, and quite a few people couldn't attend today but had registered, so the recording goes out to anyone that's registered. So that and the slides should be coming out tomorrow. Just aware we've obviously kept you a little bit over the time, and you've probably got work to do and patients to see. Yeah, there's no more questions in the chat, so thanks for all coming today. Hope it's proved useful. As I said, if you've got any more questions, just give us a call or an email,